I used to think I had it all figured out. My wife, Emily, and I had been together for 10 years, married for 8, and life was good. We had built something solid. A cozy home in the suburbs, shared inside jokes that never got old, and enough memories to fill a scrapbook. I genuinely thought she was my soulmate. She had this infectious laugh, the kind that made strangers smile in public, and she could light up a room without even trying. I felt lucky every day. Work had been keeping me busy lately. I'm in finance, and my hours are unpredictable, but I was determined to make things work. I'd been pulling long nights at the office, pushing to close a big deal so we could afford the anniversary trip Emily and I had been dreaming about for years. A month-long getaway through Europe. She always talked about seeing the lavender fields in Provence and sipping wine by the canals in Venice. I wanted to give her that. Since I'd been swamped, Emily had taken on more of the household stuff. She'd even hired a gardener to revamp the backyard, something she'd been wanting to do for ages. The guy's name was Luis. He was in his late 20s, tan, with that sort of rugged look women seem to notice. When I met him, I shook his hand, thanked him for his work, and didn't think much else of it. Over the next few weeks, the backyard transformed. The dead patches of grass were replaced by lush green turf, flower beds bloomed with vibrant colors, and a small stone pathway led to a seating area Emily loved. Every time I came home, she couldn't stop raving about it. "Luis has such a good eye for design," she'd say, her face lighting up. I was happy she had something to focus on, even if I did feel a little pang of guilt for being so absent lately. One evening, I came home early, something rare for me, and found Emily outside with Luis. They were standing near the roses, laughing about something. She didn't hear me pull into the driveway, and for a second, I just stood there watching. There wasn't anything overtly wrong with the scene. Emily was holding a watering can, Luis had dirt smudged on his shirt, and they were clearly chatting about the garden. But the way she laughed, it wasn't her usual laugh. It was softer, quieter, like she was letting him into some inside joke I wasn't a part of. "Hey, what's going on?" I called out, stepping into the backyard. Emily spun around, her smile widening when she saw me. "Hey, you're home early." She set the watering can down and came over to kiss me on the cheek. "We're just finishing up for the day. Doesn't the yard look amazing?" "It does," I said, shaking Luis's hand. "You've done a great job." "Thanks," Luis replied, giving me a polite nod before packing up his tools. That night, as Emily and I ate dinner, I couldn't shake the weird feeling I'd had watching them. It wasn't anything I could put my finger on, just a fleeting sense of something. But I let it go. I figured I was overthinking it, maybe projecting my own guilt about working so much. "Luis will be done in another week or two," Emily said as she scrolled through her phone at the table. "I'm thinking of adding a little herb garden by the patio. What do you think?" "Sounds good," I said, distractedly. I was scrolling through emails on my phone, trying to catch up on work. If I could go back to that moment, I would have looked up, paid more attention, asked her about her day instead of burying myself in my screen. But hindsight is 20/20ths, right? The days turned into weeks, and Luis kept coming by. The backyard looked stunning, and Emily seemed happier than ever. I was proud of her for taking charge of the project and bringing it to life. But there were little things I started to notice. She started dressing up more. Nothing drastic, just subtle changes, nicer tops, makeup even when she wasn't going anywhere. I joked about it once, saying, "Wow, someone's looking fancy for the garden today." She laughed it off and said she just wanted to feel good about herself. Fair enough, I thought. She had every right to want to look her best. But then there were the text messages. Started small, just her phone buzzing more than usual. She'd glance at it, smile faintly, and set it face down on the table. When I asked who it was, she'd say, "Oh, just Karen," or "just my sister." Once, though, I caught a glimpse of the screen before she locked it. The message preview read, "Can't wait to see you again. Smiley face." "Who's that from?" I asked, my tone more curious than accusatory. She hesitated for a fraction of a second, just long enough to feel off. "It's Karen," she said, slipping her phone into her pocket. "She's planning a girls' night." "Nice," I said, forcing a smile. I didn't push it. But that night, as I lay awake next to her, staring at the ceiling, the unease gnawed at me. Something felt wrong. I didn't know what it was yet, but my gut was telling me this wasn't nothing. The strange feeling in my gut didn't go away after that night. If anything, it got worse. It was like there was this invisible wall between Emily and me, one I couldn't explain but couldn't ignore. I tried to tell myself it was all in my head. I'd been stressed with work, exhausted from pulling late nights, and maybe I was just looking for problems that didn't exist. But at the same time, Emily wasn't helping. She started changing her routines, little things at first. She'd wake up earlier than usual to go for a walk, something she never used to do. And when Luis was working in the yard, she always found an excuse to be outside. Whether it was watering the plants, bringing him lemonade, or pretending to organize the patio cushions, she always seemed to be lingering around him. I tried to joke about it one evening. "You're really into this whole gardening thing lately, huh?" I said as we were eating dinner. Emily smiled, but there was a flicker of something behind it. "Nerves, maybe?" "Well, the garden's coming together, and it's nice to get fresh air," she replied casually. "Besides, you're always saying I need to pick up a hobby." "True," I said, trying to laugh it off. "But you've been spending more time with Luis than me." Her smile froze for half a second before she recovered. "That's because you're always working?" she said, a slight edge creeping into her voice. That hit me harder than I expected. She wasn't wrong. I had been distant, pouring everything into my job to give us the life we wanted. But it still stung. "I'm doing it for us," I said quietly, but she just nodded and changed the subject. Then came the phone thing. Emily had always been attached to her phone, but now it was different. She wouldn't leave it lying around like she used to. If she got up to grab a glass of water, the phone came with her. If she went to the bathroom, it went too. She started keeping it on silent, and any time it buzzed, she'd glance at the screen, smile faintly, and lock it before I could even ask. It was driving me crazy. One night, as we were watching TV, her phone buzzed on the armrest next to her. She didn't notice at first, so I glanced over out of reflex. The message preview read, "Looking forward to tomorrow? Smiley face." My stomach dropped. "Who's that?" I asked, keeping my tone casual. Emily quickly grabbed the phone, her cheeks flushing. "Oh, just Karen," she said, locking the screen and placing the phone face down on her lap. I didn't believe her. Not for a second. But I didn't say anything. I just nodded, turned my attention back to the TV, and pretended like it didn't bother me. That night, as she slept beside me, I couldn't stop replaying the moment in my head. Why would Karen send a text like that? And why did Emily seem so jumpy about it? I hated feeling like this, paranoid, suspicious. It wasn't me. It wasn't us. The next day, I came home from work earlier than usual again, hoping to catch Emily off guard. Sure enough, I found her in the backyard with Luis. They were standing by the patio, talking, and Emily was laughing at something he'd said. I watched them from the kitchen window for a moment. Luis had that same easygoing smile he always wore, but Emily, she looked different. Happier, maybe, or more alive. I couldn't put my finger on it, but it made my stomach churn. I opened the back door and stepped outside. "Hey guys," I said, trying to keep my voice light. Emily flinched slightly, but she quickly turned to me with a smile. "You're home early again." Luis gave me a polite nod. "Hey man, just wrapping up for the day." I walked over and kissed Emily on the cheek, my eyes flicking to Luis for a moment. He seemed perfectly at ease, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was interrupting something. After Luis left, I decided to bring it up, gently. "You and Luis seem to be getting along pretty well," I said as we cleaned up after dinner. Emily shot me a confused look. "What do you mean?" "I don't know," I said with a shrug. "You're always out there talking with him. You've been spending a lot of time together." She laughed, but it sounded forced. "He's just easy to talk to, that's all. And I'm out there because it's my garden, Alex. I'm allowed to care about it." "Of course," I said quickly, not wanting to push too hard. "I didn't mean anything by it." But she was already on the defensive. "You're acting like there's something wrong with me being friendly with him." "I didn't say that," I said, raising my hands in surrender. "I was just making an observation." "Well, maybe you should stop observing and start being home more," she snapped. Her words cut deeper than I expected. After that, I backed off. I didn't want to fight, but the nagging feeling in my gut wouldn't go away. That weekend, Emily told me she was going to a friend's house for a girls' night. I wanted to believe her. I really did, but something didn't sit right. While she was out, I decided to check our shared tablet. Emily's phone was synced to it, so I figured if there was anything suspicious, I'd find it there. It didn't take long. There were text messages between Emily and someone labeled L. Most of them were casual, talking about plants, schedules, and the garden, but some of them made my blood run cold. "I love our little talks. They make my day. You looked amazing today. Can't wait to see you again." I stared at the screen, my heart pounding. L had to be Luis. Who else could it be? I wanted to scream, to throw the tablet across the room, but I forced myself to stay calm. This wasn't proof of anything physical, but it was enough to tell me that something wasn't right. I needed answers. Couldn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those texts on the tablet. Her little chats with L played on repeat in my mind like a broken record. I wanted to believe there was some innocent explanation, but deep down I knew better. The next morning, Emily acted like everything was normal. She was humming while making coffee, scrolling through her phone like nothing had happened. I watched her from the table, wondering how she could seem so calm. "You okay?" she asked, catching me staring. "Yeah, just tired." I lied. She didn't press further, just smiled and handed me a mug. "You've been working too hard. Maybe you should take a day off soon." I nodded, barely hearing her. My mind was somewhere else entirely. Later that afternoon, I decided to test the waters. I casually asked Emily about Luis while we were folding laundry. "So, is Luis almost done with the yard?" "Yeah, just a few finishing touches left," she replied, not looking up from the shirt she was folding. "Do you talk to him much when he's here?" I asked, trying to sound casual. She hesitated for a fraction of a second before answering. "Not really, just about the garden stuff." I knew it was a lie because I'd seen the texts. My jaw tightened, but I forced myself to play it cool. "That's good," I said lightly. "He seems like a nice guy." "He is," she said a little too quickly. I dropped the subject after that, but the unease in my chest grew heavier. The next day, I decided to leave work early again. I told my boss I wasn't feeling well, which wasn't entirely a lie. My stomach had been in knots all morning. When I pulled into the driveway, I noticed Emily and Luis standing by the side gate. They were talking, but their body language was off. She was holding her phone in one hand and gesturing with the other, like she was trying to explain something. Luis had his arms crossed, nodding along, but there was an intensity to their conversation that made my heart race. I stayed in the car for a moment watching them. Then, Emily reached out and touched his arm. It was a quick, light touch, but it was enough to make my blood boil. I got out of the car, slamming the door harder than I intended. They both looked up immediately. Emily's face lit up with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "You're home early again," she said, walking over to meet me. "Yeah, work was slow," I said, glancing at Luis. He gave me his usual polite nod but seemed less relaxed than usual. "Luis was just about to head out," Emily said quickly. "Don't let me interrupt," I said, forcing a smile. Luis gave a small wave and muttered a quick goodbye before heading to his truck. I watched him leave, my hands clenched into fists. Once he was gone, I turned to Emily. "What was that about?" "What was what about?" she asked, feigning confusion. "You and Luis. You looked like you were having a serious conversation." "We were just talking about the garden," she said with a shrug. "Nothing important." Felt like she was trying too hard to seem casual, but I didn't push it. Not yet. Over the next few days, I started paying closer attention. I noticed the way she'd light up when Luis was around, how she always seemed to find an excuse to be outside when he was working. I noticed how her phone never left her side and how she'd angle the screen away from me whenever she was texting. One night, I decided I couldn't take it anymore. After Emily went to bed, I grabbed the tablet and synced it to her phone again. I told myself I just needed to know the truth, whatever it was. Sure enough, there were more messages from Elle. This time, they were even worse. You looked so beautiful today. I wish we had more time to talk. I can't stop thinking about you. I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. My hands were shaking as I scrolled through the texts. There was no mistaking it now. This wasn't just friendly. But then, I saw something that stopped me cold. A message from Emily. Maybe we shouldn't do this anymore. It's too risky. Followed by a reply from Luis. I understand, but I don't want to stop seeing you. I stared at the screen, my heart pounding so loudly I thought it might wake Emily. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what I'd just read. She knew it was wrong. She knew it was risky, and yet she hadn't stopped. I felt a wave of anger, betrayal, and heartbreak crash over me all at once. I wanted to wake her up, demand answers, scream at her for what she'd done. But I didn't. Instead, I put the tablet down, walked into the bathroom, and splashed cold water on my face. I stared at myself in the mirror, trying to figure out what the hell I was supposed to do next. By the time I went back to bed, Emily was sleeping peacefully, completely unaware that her little secret wasn't a secret anymore. The next morning, everything felt different. Emily acted like it was just another normal day, like she hadn't been sending messages to another man, like she hadn't touched his arm in a way that wasn't meant for me to see. But for me, nothing about us felt normal anymore. I couldn't stop replaying the messages in my head. I don't want to stop seeing you. Those words looped endlessly, like some cruel mantra. And her response? Maybe we shouldn't do this anymore. That word, maybe, felt like a dagger. It wasn't a hard stop. It wasn't, this has to end. It was tentative, as if she hadn't fully decided whether her marriage was worth it. I had a choice to make. I could confront her right then and there, lay all the evidence on the table, and demand an explanation. Or I could wait, gather more information, and figure out how far this had really gone. I wanted the full truth, not just what she might confess under pressure. So I waited. That afternoon, I pretended to go to work but parked down the street instead. I wanted to see for myself what was really going on. My heart was pounding as I sat there, trying not to psych myself out. Around noon, Luis's truck pulled into the driveway. I felt a surge of adrenaline as I watched him step out, dressed in his usual work clothes. He grabbed his tools from the back of the truck and headed into the backyard. A few minutes later, Emily appeared. She was holding 2 glasses of lemonade and wearing a sundress I hadn't seen before. It wasn't revealing, but it was different. New. The kind of thing you buy when you want to feel noticed. I shifted lower in my seat, my palms sweating as I watched them from a distance. They stood by the patio, talking and laughing. Emily handed him the lemonade, and for a moment, they looked like any 2 people enjoying a sunny afternoon. But then, Luis stepped closer to her. Too close. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but their body language said enough. Luis leaned in slightly, his head tilted toward her like he was sharing some private thought. Emily laughed softly, then reached out to brush something off his shirt. Just a quick gesture, but one that felt far too intimate for my liking. I clenched the steering wheel, every muscle in my body tense. Part of me wanted to get out of the car and put an end to it right then. But I held back. I needed to see where this would go. They didn't do anything overtly incriminating, but the way they looked at each other, it was undeniable. There was something there. When Luis finally packed up and left, I drove home and tried to act like everything was fine. Emily greeted me with a kiss, her smile bright and cheerful, as if nothing was amiss. "How was work?" she asked, heading to the kitchen to start dinner. "Busy," I said, forcing a smile. I didn't want to eat. I didn't want to sit across from her and pretend like I didn't know. But I had to play the part. I had to keep this act going until I had all the answers. That night, after Emily went to bed, I did something I never thought I'd do. I set up a hidden camera in the backyard. I hated myself for it, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this than I'd seen so far. The next day, I left for work as usual but made an excuse to leave early again. This time, I didn't park down the street. I went to a coffee shop and waited, watching the camera feed on my phone. Sure enough, Luis showed up around noon. Emily came out shortly after, wearing the same sundress. They stood by the patio again, talking, but this time, something was different. Luis reached into his pocket and pulled out what looked like a small notebook. He handed it to Emily, and she opened it, flipping through the pages with a smile. I couldn't see what was written, but the look on her face told me it wasn't just a list of gardening tips. Then it happened. Luis stepped closer to her, and for a moment, I thought he was going to kiss her. But instead, he reached up and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. Emily didn't pull away. She didn't step back. She just stood there, letting him touch her like it was the most natural thing in the world. My chest tightened as I watched. This wasn't just some harmless flirtation. This was something deeper, something that shouldn't have been happening in my backyard. When I got home later that evening, Emily was already cooking dinner. She greeted me with the same bright smile, but all I could see was the way she'd looked at Luis. "How was your day?" she asked, stirring a pot on the stove. "Fine," I said, my voice tight. She glanced at me, her brow furrowing slightly. "You sure? You seem off." "I'm just tired," I lied. "Long day at work." She nodded, but I could tell she didn't entirely believe me. That night, I reviewed the footage from the hidden camera again, hoping I'd missed something, some detail that would prove I was wrong. But there it was, plain as day. The way she smiled at him, the way he reached out to touch her. It was all there. I felt sick to my stomach, but I knew I couldn't confront her yet. Not until I had more. Not until I knew exactly how far this had gone. I was barely holding it together at this point. Every interaction with Emily felt fake, like we were playing roles in a bad movie. I'd smile when I had to, crack jokes when it felt appropriate, but inside, I was boiling. I couldn't decide what hurt more, knowing she was betraying me or seeing her act so normal about it. But I wasn't ready to confront her. Not yet. A few days later, as I was pulling out of the driveway to head to work, I saw Mrs. Carter, our neighbor from across the street, walking her little dog. Mrs. Carter was one of those retired ladies who always seemed to know everything about everyone in the neighborhood. Normally, I'd wave and keep driving, but she flagged me down, motioning for me to roll down my window. "Good morning, Alex," she said cheerfully, her dog sniffing around the edge of my car. "Morning, Mrs. Carter," I said, forcing a smile. "How are you?" "Oh, I'm fine," she said, leaning in closer. "I just wanted to tell you how beautiful your backyard is looking. That gardener of yours is doing such a fantastic job." "Yeah, Luis has been great," I said cautiously, not sure where this was going. She nodded, then dropped the bombshell. "I saw him leaving your house the other day with your wife. They drove off together in his truck. I thought it was so sweet that she was helping him pick out plants or whatever it was." My stomach turned. "Oh, when was that?" I asked, trying to sound casual. "Oh, let me think." She tapped her chin thoughtfully. "It was Monday in the early afternoon. Around 1, I think. They looked like they were in a hurry." I gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. Monday. That was the same day Emily had told me she'd been out running errands. "Thanks for letting me know," I said, forcing a smile. "Of course, dear. Well, I won't keep you. Have a good day," she said, giving me a little wave as she continued down the street. I sat there for a moment, trying to process what she'd just said. Emily and Luis had left the house together, and she hadn't mentioned it at all. Why? And where had they gone? I went to work, but I couldn't focus on anything. My mind kept going back to what Mrs. Carter had said. If they'd been together on Monday, what were the chances that was the only time? That evening, I decided to bring it up, not directly, but in a way that might catch Emily off guard. As we sat down for dinner, I casually asked, "Hey, did you do anything fun on Monday?" Emily froze for half a second, just long enough for me to notice. Then she smiled and said, "Not really. Just ran some errands, like I told you." "Where'd you go?" I pressed, keeping my tone light. She hesitated again, just a beat too long. Oh, Target, the grocery store, stuff like that. I nodded, pretending to believe her, but my gut told me she was lying. After dinner, she went to take a shower, and I grabbed her phone while she was in the bathroom. I knew her passcode. It was the same one she'd been using for years. My hands shook as I opened her messages. I scrolled past the usual chats with her sister and her friends, searching for anything from Luis. But there was nothing. No messages, no calls. Then it hit me. She must have deleted them. I put the phone back where I'd found it and sat on the couch, my mind racing. If she was deleting their conversations, that meant she knew they were wrong. She knew I'd be suspicious if I saw them. Later that night, I checked the hidden camera footage again. I went through the clips from Monday, hoping to find some clue about where they'd gone. And there it was. Around 12:45, Emily and Luis were standing by the patio, talking. Luis gestured toward his truck, and Emily nodded. A few minutes later, they walked out of the backyard together. Emily was carrying her purse, and they got into his truck and drove off. I fast-forwarded through the footage, waiting for them to come back. They didn't return until nearly 3 hours later. Emily got out of the truck holding a small bag, like the kind you'd get from a boutique, and smiled at Luis before heading inside. 3 hours. What the hell had they been doing for 3 hours? I felt like I was going to be sick. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. This wasn't just some harmless flirtation anymore. They were spending time together outside of the house, lying to me about it, and covering their tracks. The next morning, I decided to confront Luis. I waited until Emily left for her yoga class, then called Luis, pretending I had questions about the garden. He agreed to meet me at the house around noon. When he arrived, I didn't waste any time. "Look, Luis," I said, my voice steady but cold. "I know something's going on between you and Emily." His eyes widened in surprise, but he quickly composed himself. "I don't know what you're talking about, man. We've just been working on the garden." "Don't lie to me," I said, stepping closer. "I've seen the texts. I know you left the house together on Monday. Just tell me the truth." He hesitated, glancing toward the backyard like he was looking for an escape route. "It's not what you think," he said finally. "We just went to a nursery to pick out plants. That's all." "For 3 hours?" I shot back. "Come on, Luis. You expect me to believe that?" He opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. "Look," I said, lowering my voice. "I just want the truth. If you respect me at all, you'll tell me what's really going on." Luis looked down at the ground, his hands in his pockets. "I'm sorry, man," he muttered. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen." My stomach dropped. "So, there is something going on." He didn't say anything, but the guilty look on his face was all the confirmation I needed. Luis stood there, staring at the ground, and for a moment, I wasn't sure if I wanted to scream at him or walk away. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like I could hear it in my ears. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen," he said again, his voice low, almost like he was talking to himself. "What exactly did happen?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady even though I felt like I was on the edge of losing it. "Because right now I've got bits and pieces. I want the whole truth, Luis." He hesitated, his hands fidgeting in his pockets. "Look, I don't want to cause any problems. Emily's a great person, and I—" "Stop," I said, cutting him off. "Just tell me, did you sleep with her?" Luis looked up at me, his face pale, and shook his head. "No, I swear it hasn't gone that far." I didn't know whether to believe him. His words sounded sincere, but the guilt in his eyes made me question everything. "Then what?" I demanded. "You don't just exchange flirty texts and take secret trips with someone for no reason. What the hell is going on between you two?" "We've just been talking," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "She told me she's lonely, that you're always working, and she feels like you don't notice her anymore." I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. "So what? You thought you'd step in and be her emotional support system?" "It wasn't like that," he said quickly. "It just happened." I stared at him, my hands clenched into fists at my sides. I wanted to believe him when he said it hadn't gone physical, but my gut told me there was more to the story. "You need to stay away from her," I said through gritted teeth. "Finish the garden if you have to, but after that I don't want to see you here again. Got it?" Luis nodded, his shoulders slumping like a scolded kid. "I'm sorry, man. I didn't mean for things to get this far." Without another word, I turned and went back into the house, slamming the door behind me. I stood in the kitchen, my hands gripping the counter as I tried to process what had just happened. Luis's confession confirmed what I'd suspected all along, but it didn't make me feel any better. If anything, I felt worse. The man I'd hired to work on my home, the man I trusted, had been flirting with my wife right under my nose. When Emily got home that evening, I watched her closely. She acted like everything was fine, chatting about her yoga class and asking me about my day. It was infuriating. How could she sit there, lying to my face, after everything she'd done? I knew I couldn't keep this up much longer. The tension was eating me alive, and I was seconds away from snapping. But I needed more proof, something undeniable. The next day, while Emily was out, I installed another hidden camera in the living room. If they were meeting inside the house while I was at work, I wanted to know about it. For the next few days, I kept a close eye on the footage. I checked the backyard camera and the living room camera every evening, hoping to catch something that would give me the answers I needed. First, it was the same old routine. Luis would come over, work on the garden, and Emily would hover around him, finding excuses to be outside. They'd talk and laugh, but nothing incriminating happened. Then, on Friday, I caught something that made my blood run cold. I was reviewing the footage from the living room camera when I saw Emily and Luis come inside the house together. Emily was holding a plate of cookies, and it looked like she'd invited him in for a snack. They sat on the couch, talking and laughing, and at first it seemed innocent enough. But then Luis leaned in closer, and Emily didn't back away. They weren't touching yet, but the way they looked at each other was enough to make my stomach churn. And then it happened. Luis reached out and brushed a strand of hair behind Emily's ear, just like he'd done in the backyard. She didn't pull away. Instead, she smiled and placed her hand on his knee, her fingers lingering for just a moment too long. That was all I needed to see. I turned off the footage and sat there in silence, my mind racing. I'd been holding on to some small sliver of hope that maybe this wasn't as bad as I thought. But that hope was gone now. Emily was cheating on me. Maybe it hadn't gone physical yet. At least not that I'd seen, but it was only a matter of time. That night, I could barely look at her. She sat across from me at the dinner table, talking about her plans for the weekend, completely oblivious to the storm brewing inside me. "Are you okay?" she asked, noticing my silence. "Yeah," I said, forcing a smile. "Just tired. I don't know how I managed to get through that meal without exploding. All I wanted to do was scream at her, demand answers, and make her admit what she'd done. But I knew I needed to stay calm. Later that night, after she went to bed, I sat in the living room, staring at the hidden camera footage again. I kept replaying that moment when Luis touched her hair, trying to make sense of it all. How had we gotten here? What had I done wrong? I didn't have the answers yet, but I knew one thing for sure. I couldn't keep pretending everything was okay. The time for waiting was over. By the time Saturday rolled around, I knew I couldn't keep quiet any longer. The hidden camera footage played on a loop in my head. Luis brushing her hair back, her hand lingering on his knee. It was like a splinter in my brain that I couldn't remove. I decided to confront her that night. No more guessing, no more holding it in. I needed answers, and I needed them straight from her. We were in the living room after dinner, sitting on opposite sides of the couch. She was scrolling through her phone, and I was pretending to watch TV, though I hadn't processed a single thing on the screen. "Emily," I said finally, my voice low but firm. She looked up, startled. "Yeah, we need to talk." Her expression shifted slightly, just a flicker of something. Fear? Guilt? She quickly masked it with a neutral smile. "Okay, what's going on?" I turned off the TV and faced her. "I know about Luis." Her smile froze, and for a second, The room felt deathly silent. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice a little too calm. "Don't do that," I said, my tone sharper now. "Don't play dumb. I've seen the texts. I've seen how you act around him. And I know about Monday. Mrs. Carter saw you leave with him." Her eyes widened for a moment, and I saw her throat tighten as she swallowed hard. I'm going to ask you one question," I said, cutting her off. "And I want the truth. Have you been cheating on me?" Her face crumpled, and she let out a shaky breath. "Alex, it's not what you think." "Then tell me what it is," I snapped. She hesitated, her hands twisting nervously in her lap. "Luis and we've been talking. That's it. I swear." "Talking?" I said, raising an eyebrow. "Talking doesn't explain the way you look at him. It doesn't explain the texts where he says he can't stop thinking about you. And it sure as hell doesn't explain why you've been deleting your conversations with him." Tears started welling up in her eyes, but I didn't feel sorry for her. "Not this time. I didn't mean for it to happen," she said, her voice trembling. "I was lonely, Alex. You're always working, and I felt invisible." "Invisible?" I said, my voice rising. "Are you kidding me? I've been working my ass off for us, Emily. For this house. For that anniversary trip you wanted so badly. And you repay me by running around with the gardener." She flinched at the word gardener, like it was some kind of insult. "It wasn't like that," she said, wiping at her eyes. "I never wanted it to go this far." "So, how far did it go?" I demanded. She looked down at her hands, her voice barely above a whisper. "It was just emotional." "Bullshit," I said, standing up. "I've seen the way he touches you. I've seen you let him. Don't sit there and tell me it was just emotional." Her head snapped up, her face pale. "You've been spying on me? Don't try to turn this around on me," I said, pointing a finger at her. "You're the one who lied. You're the one sneaking around with another man." I had every right to find out the truth. She was crying now, full on sobbing, but I didn't care. I felt numb, like I'd been hollowed out from the inside. "I need you to tell me everything," I said, sitting back down. "Right now. How long has this been going on?" She sniffled, her shoulders shaking. "A few months," she said quietly. "It started when he began working on the yard. At first it was just casual, small talk, you know? But then, I don't know, he made me feel noticed, like I mattered." "Great," I said bitterly. "I hope you enjoyed the attention because you just threw away 10 years of marriage for it." "I didn't mean to," she cried. "I love you, Alex. I never stopped loving you. I was stupid. I made a mistake." "A mistake," I said, laughing bitterly. "A mistake is forgetting to take out the trash. This wasn't a mistake, Emily. This was a choice. You chose to text him, to meet him, to let him into our house. That wasn't a mistake. That was deliberate." She buried her face in her hands, and for a moment, neither of us said anything. The only sound was the ticking of the clock on the wall. Finally, I spoke. "Did you sleep with him?" "No," she said quickly, looking up at me with red, puffy eyes. "I swear, Alex, it never got physical." I studied her face, searching for any sign of a lie. I wanted to believe her, but after everything I'd seen, I didn't know if I could. "I don't know if I can believe you," I said quietly. "Please," she begged, reaching for my hand. "I'm telling you the truth. It didn't go that far. I ended it before it could." "Ended it?" I repeated. "You're still texting him, Emily. You're still sneaking around with him." She shook her head frantically. "I told him it had to stop. I swear, Alex. I haven't seen him since Monday." "That's another lie," I said, pulling my hand away. "Because I saw you with him yesterday. In our living room." Her eyes widened, and her face went pale. "You what?" I nodded slowly. "That's right. I saw everything. I saw him touch your hair. I saw you put your hand on his knee. Don't sit there and tell me you ended it when you clearly haven't." She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. I stood up, pacing the room as I tried to collect my thoughts. "You need to pack a bag," I said finally. What? She asked, her voice trembling. I need space, I said, turning to face her. You're going to stay somewhere else for a while. I can't be around you right now. Alex, please, she said, standing up and reaching for me. We can fix this. I'll do whatever it takes. Just don't push me away. You already pushed me away, I said coldly. Now it's my turn. She broke down sobbing, but I didn't comfort her. I just stood there, watching as the life we'd built together crumbled around us. Emily left that night. She packed a small suitcase, tears streaming down her face, and drove off to stay with her sister. I didn't stop her. Couldn't. I needed the house to myself, needed time to think without her hovering around, begging for forgiveness I wasn't ready to give. The silence in the house was deafening. I sat in the living room, staring at the spot where she and Luis had sat on the couch. Every detail was burned into my memory. The way she'd smiled at him, the way he'd brushed her hair back, the way her hand lingered just a little too long on his knee. The anger I'd been holding back started to bubble to the surface. I clenched my fists, my jaw tightening as I thought about everything she'd done. How could she betray me like this? How could she look me in the eyes, day after day, and pretend everything was fine? But then, a darker thought crept in. What if she was still lying? What if there was more to this than she was letting on? I couldn't shake the feeling that I didn't have the full story yet. Emily had claimed it was just emotional, but something about the way she'd hesitated during our conversation didn't sit right with me. And Luis's reaction when I confronted him, that guilty, nervous look on his face, it all pointed to something more. I decided I needed to talk to Luis again. This time, I wasn't going to let him dance around the truth. The next morning, I called him, pretending I had a question about the garden. He sounded hesitant but agreed to meet me at a coffee shop nearby. I think he knew what was coming. When I walked in, Luis was already there, sitting at a corner table with a cup of coffee in front of him. He looked up when he saw me, his expression tense. Thanks for meeting me, I said, sitting across from him. No problem, he said, though his tone was far from relaxed. I got straight to the point. I need the truth, Luis. All of it. No more half answers, no more dodging. Just tell me what's really been going on between you and Emily. He sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. I already told you, man. We've just been talking. That's all. I shook my head. I don't believe you. You don't look at someone the way you look at Emily if it's just talking. And she doesn't act the way she does around you if there's nothing more going on. Luis didn't say anything, his eyes fixed on his coffee cup. I know you've been spending time together outside of the house, I continued. I know about Monday, and I've seen the footage from the house. So, I'll ask you again. Did you sleep with her? His jaw tightened, and he finally looked up at me. We didn't sleep together, he said quietly. Then what? I asked, leaning forward. What the hell have you been doing with my wife? Luis hesitated for what felt like an eternity. Then, he let out a long breath and said, We kissed, a few times. My stomach dropped, and I felt my hands clench into fists under the table. When? It started a few weeks ago, he admitted. One day after work, she kissed me. I didn't stop her. I should have, but I didn't. And after that, it just kept happening. Where? I asked, my voice cold and steady. Mostly in the backyard, he said, avoiding my eyes. Once or twice inside, when you weren't home. I felt like I was going to be sick. The thought of him and Emily in our home, in the space we'd built together, made my blood boil. Did it ever go beyond that? I asked. No, he said quickly. I swear, Alex, we didn't sleep together. She wanted to stop. She told me it was too risky. Risky, I said, my voice dripping with sarcasm. Yeah, because that's the only reason to stop. Luis winced but didn't argue. I leaned back in my chair, my mind racing. Part of me wanted to believe him, to believe that it had only been a few kisses and nothing more. But after everything I'd seen, could I really trust his word? You need to stay away from her, I said finally. Don't call her, Don't text her. Don't come near my house. Do you understand? He nodded. Yeah, I get it. I stood up, ready to leave, but then I stopped and looked at him one last time. Why her? I asked. Why did you do it? Luis hesitated, then said, because she seemed unhappy, and I thought, I don't know. I thought I could make her feel better. Yeah, well, congratulations, I said bitterly. You made her feel better, and you destroyed my marriage in the process. I walked out of the coffee shop, my hands shaking with anger. When I got home, I sat in the living room and stared at the wall, trying to process everything Luis had told me. It didn't matter if they hadn't slept together. The fact that they'd kissed, that they'd shared those moments behind my back, was enough to shatter whatever trust one had left in Emily. That night, Emily called me from her sister's house. I let it go to voicemail. She left a long, tearful message, begging me to talk to her, saying she'd do anything to fix things. But I didn't call her back. I wasn't ready to hear her excuses again. The days after Emily left were some of the loneliest and most confusing of my life. The house was quiet, almost too quiet, and I wasn't sure if I felt better or worse without her there. On one hand, I didn't have to see her face, didn't have to pretend like everything was normal. On the other hand, every empty room felt like a reminder of what had been broken. She called and texted constantly, each message more desperate than the last. First, I ignored her. I didn't have the emotional bandwidth to deal with her apologies and promises to change. I needed space to think. But the more I sat alone in that house, the more the anger began to give way to something else. Sadness. Had I failed her? Failed our marriage? I started replaying the last few years in my head, searching for the cracks I might have missed. I remembered all the nights I'd stayed late at work, all the weekends I'd spent glued to my laptop instead of spending time with her. Maybe I'd been blind to how unhappy she was, too focused on providing for her to notice that she needed more than a nice house and a dream vacation. But then, I'd think about her and Luis, the texts, the lies, the stolen kisses, and the sadness would morph back into anger. No matter how lonely she'd been, there were 1,000 other ways she could have handled it. She could have talked to me, gone to therapy, done anything but this. After a few days of silence, I finally called her back. When she picked up, her voice was shaky. Alex, it's me, I said flatly. There was a pause. I'm so glad you called, she said softly. I've been losing my mind not hearing from you. I'm sure, I said, my tone cold. Listen, I need you to come by the house tomorrow. We need to talk, face to face. Okay, she said quickly. I'll be there, whatever time works for you. 10 in the morning, I said. Don't be late. When I hung up, I felt a strange sense of relief. I wasn't entirely sure what I was going to say to her, but at least I was finally taking some control over the situation. The next morning, I sat in the living room, waiting for her to arrive. I'd been up half the night, trying to figure out what I wanted out of this conversation. Closure? Answers? Or maybe just the satisfaction of seeing her squirm. At exactly 10 o'clock, I heard her car pull into the driveway. A minute later, she knocked on the door. When I opened it, she looked nervous, her eyes red and puffy from crying. She was holding a folder, and I noticed her hands were shaking. Hey, she said softly, her voice tentative. I stepped aside to let her in without saying a word. She walked into the living room and sat on the edge of the couch, clutching the folder in her lap like it was a lifeline. Thanks for letting me come over, she said. I sat down across from her, leaning forward with my elbows on my knees. Let's get straight to the point, Emily. Why are you here? She flinched slightly at the bluntness of my tone but nodded. I want to apologize, she said, her voice trembling. For everything. For lying to you. For hurting you. I was selfish, and I wasn't thinking about what it would do to you. I stayed silent, letting her words hang in the air. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, she continued, tears streaming down her face. But I need you to know that I love you, Alex. I've always loved you, and I'll do whatever it takes to fix this. She opened the folder and pulled out a few pieces of paper, placing them on the coffee table in front of me. I've already started seeing a therapist, she said. I've been going every day since I left. And I signed us up for couples counseling, if you're willing to try. I glanced at the papers but didn't touch them. I've blocked Luis's number, she added quickly. I'll never talk to him again, I swear. You can check my phone if you want. Don't bother, I said, my voice calm but cold. I already talked to Luis. I know what happened between you two. Her face went pale. What did he tell you? Enough, I said. He told me about the kissing, about how you said you wanted to stop but didn't. She buried her face in her hands, sobbing. I'm so sorry, she choked out. I was stupid and weak, and I let things go too far. But it didn't mean anything, Alex. It wasn't real. You're the one I want to be with. I leaned back in my chair, crossing my arms over my chest. Do you have any idea how hard it is for me to believe that? You lied to me for months, Emily. Every time I asked you what was going on, you looked me in the eye and lied. How am I supposed to trust anything you say now? I'll earn it back, she said desperately. I'll do whatever it takes. I'll give you access to all my accounts, my phone, everything. Just, please don't give up on us. Her words hung in the air, heavy and desperate. For a long time, I didn't say anything. I just sat there, staring at her, trying to figure out if there was even a shred of the woman I'd married left in her. I need time, I said finally. Time to figure out if this is even worth saving. She nodded quickly, wiping her tears. Take all the time you need. I'll wait. I'll wait as long as it takes. After she left, I sat alone in the living room, staring at the folder she'd left behind. Therapy records, counseling sign-up forms, promises of change. It all felt so hollow. Part of me wanted to believe her. Part of me wanted to forgive her and move on, to try and rebuild what we had. But the other part of me, the part that kept replaying the hidden camera footage and Luis's confession, wasn't sure I'd ever be able to look at her the same way again. 2 weeks passed, and Emily stayed at her sister's place like I'd asked. She sent the occasional text, short messages to check in or remind me that she was still willing to do whatever it took to fix things, but I kept my responses brief. I wasn't ready to have any real conversations with her yet. I needed space to think. In those 2 weeks, I threw myself into work, hoping to distract myself from the chaos of my personal life. But every time I walked into the house, every time I sat alone in the silence, the memories came rushing back. The messages, the lies, Luis brushing her hair back, her hand on his knee. I started to wonder if I'd ever be able to move past it. Then, one afternoon, Emily called me out of the blue. It wasn't one of her usual texts or voicemails. This was a direct call. I stared at my phone for a moment, debating whether to answer. Finally, I picked up. What is it, Emily? I said, my tone neutral. There was a long pause on the other end. When she finally spoke, her voice was shaky. Alex, I need to tell you something. I sighed, already feeling the weight of whatever she was about to say. What now? I didn't know how to bring this up, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. But, I'm pregnant. The words hit me like a freight train. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. What? I said, my voice cold and disbelieving. I'm pregnant, she repeated, her tone desperate. I just found out a few days ago. I was going to wait until we talked more, but I couldn't hold it in any longer. I stood there in stunned silence, my mind racing. Pregnant. She was pregnant. Is it mine? I asked, my voice sharp. Her breath caught on the other end of the line. Yes, Alex. Of course it's yours. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. How do I know that, Emily? How can I trust you after everything that's happened? She let out a choked sob. Because it is. I swear, Alex. Luis and I never. Stop, I said, cutting her off. Don't say it again. I've heard it enough times. I'll take a paternity test, she said quickly. I'll do whatever it takes to prove it to you. But, Alex, this baby is yours. I know it is. I sank onto the couch, my head in my hands. A baby. Everything about my life was already falling apart. And now this? I need time to process this. I said finally, my voice heavy. Of course, she said softly. Take as much time as you need. But I want you to know that I'm keeping the baby, no matter what happens between us. After I hung up, I sat there for what felt like hours, replaying the conversation in my head. If she was telling the truth, if the baby was mine, what the hell was I supposed to do? The first doubts. The next few days were a blur. I couldn't focus at work, couldn't sleep at night. My mind kept circling back to the same question. Was the baby really mine? Emily's assurance wasn't enough. I needed proof. So, I called her back and told her I wanted a paternity test as soon as possible. She agreed without hesitation, which surprised me. Part of me had expected her to resist, but she sounded almost relieved. We scheduled an appointment at a clinic, and a few days later we met there to give our samples. The whole thing felt surreal. Emily sat next to me in the waiting room, her hands folded nervously in her lap. She tried to make small talk, but I didn't engage. When it was over, she looked at me with tears in her eyes. I know you don't believe me, but I swear, Alex, it's yours. We'll see, I said coldly, walking out without another word. The waiting game, the wait for the results was agonizing. Every day felt like an eternity, and I couldn't think about anything else. What would I do if it was mine? Could I co-parent with her? Could I even look at her without seeing Luis? And what if it wasn't mine? I tried to prepare myself for either outcome, but the truth was, there was no way to prepare for something like this. Then, finally, the results came in. I got the call while I was at work. My heart was pounding as I stepped outside to answer it. Mr. Daniels? The nurse said on the other end of the line. We have the results of your paternity test. Go ahead, I said, my voice tight. There was a brief pause, and then she said, You are the biological father. I felt like the ground had shifted beneath me. My hands started to shake, and I had to lean against the wall to steady myself. Thank you, I said numbly, ending the call. It was mine. The baby was mine. What now? That night, Emily called me again. She was crying, but this time, her tears didn't feel manipulative or desperate. They felt real. I know you don't trust me, she said, her voice breaking, but I need you to know that I'm going to spend the rest of my life making this up to you. I'll do whatever it takes, Alex. I just want us to be a family. I didn't know how to respond. Part of me wanted to believe her, to try and salvage something for the sake of the baby. But another part of me couldn't forget the betrayal, couldn't let go of the image of her and Luis in my living room. I need more time, I said finally, to figure out what I want, what's best for the baby. Take all the time you need, she said through her tears. But deep down, I wasn't sure time would be enough. The days following the paternity test results felt like a blur. I knew the baby was mine, but that didn't make anything easier. If anything, it made everything harder. There was no clean break, no simple way to walk away. Emily and I were tied together now, whether I liked it or not. She kept calling and texting, and for the first time, I actually responded. I didn't know if it was because I wanted to or because I felt obligated to, but I started letting her back in, just a little. She asked about how I was feeling, about work, about what I wanted to do next. And every time, I gave her the same answer, I don't know, because I didn't. One weekend, she asked if we could meet in person again to talk. I agreed, mostly because I wanted to lay everything out once and for all. We decided to meet at a park near her sister's house. A neutral space where we could have some privacy without the weight of our shared home looming over us. When I arrived, Emily was sitting on a bench, her hands folded in her lap. She looked tired, like she hadn't slept in days. She smiled faintly when she saw me, but it didn't reach her eyes. Thanks for meeting me, she said as I sat down next to her. Let's get straight to it, I said, my tone firm but calm. What exactly do you want from me, Emily? She took a deep breath, her fingers fidgeting nervously. I want us to try again, she said. I want to rebuild what we had, for us and for the baby. I know I messed up, more than messed up, but I'm willing to do whatever it takes to earn your trust back. Therapy, counseling, transparency, anything you need. I'll do it. I looked at her, studying her face. She seemed sincere, but sincerity didn't erase the months of lies and betrayal. "And what about Luis?" I asked, my voice sharp. Her eyes widened slightly, and she shook her head. "I haven't talked to him since that day. I swear. I blocked his number, and I've avoided the places I know he goes. He's completely out of my life." "Good," I said, leaning back on the bench. "But that doesn't change what happened. It doesn't change the fact that you lied to me for months, that you let this happen in the first place." "I know," she said, her voice breaking. "I know I hurt you, Alex, and I hate myself for it. But I can't go back and change the past. All I can do is prove to you that I'm committed to making things right." I was quiet for a long time, staring out at the park. There were kids playing on the swings, couples walking hand in hand, and a man throwing a frisbee for his dog. It was all so normal, and yet my life felt anything but. "Emily," I said finally, turning to face her, "I don't think I can ever trust you again. And without trust, there's no marriage." Her face crumpled, and tears streamed down her cheeks. "Alex, please, let me finish," I said gently. "I think we're done as a couple, but we're not done as parents. This baby deserves the best version of both of us, even if we can't be together." She covered her face with her hands, sobbing quietly. I didn't reach out to comfort her. Couldn't. "I'll be there for the baby," I said. "Every step of the way. We'll figure out co-parenting, and I'll support you through the pregnancy. But as far as our marriage goes, it's over." For a long time, neither of us said anything. I just sat there, letting her cry, feeling the weight of my decision settle over me. It wasn't an easy choice, but it felt like the right one. When Emily finally looked up at me, her eyes were red and swollen. "I understand," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't deserve you, Alex. I know that. But I'll do whatever I can to make sure we're good parents. For the baby." I nodded, feeling a small sense of relief. At least we were on the same page about that. The divorce. Over the next few weeks, I started the process of filing for divorce. It was painful, but it was also freeing. Emily and I agreed to keep things amicable, especially with the baby on the way. She stayed at her sister's house, and I stayed in the home we'd shared, at least for now. We started talking more about practical things like doctor's appointments and financial arrangements. For the first time in months, our conversations felt honest. There was no pretense, no lies, just two people trying to navigate a messy situation. At one point, she asked if I thought we'd ever be able to be friends again. I told her I didn't know. "I think we'll always care about each other," I said. "But things won't ever go back to the way they were." She nodded, tears in her eyes but no argument on her lips. Moving on. By the time the divorce was finalized, I felt like a weight had been lifted off my shoulders. It wasn't the life I'd envisioned, but it was a fresh start. I sold the house, moved to a smaller place closer to my office, and started focusing on rebuilding myself. Emily and I stayed in contact, mostly to discuss the baby. She kept me updated on her appointments, and I went with her to the first ultrasound. Seeing that tiny heartbeat on the screen was surreal. It reminded me that, despite everything, something good had come out of this mess. But I also knew that co-parenting would come with its own set of challenges. We'd have to navigate birthdays, holidays, and all the little moments in between. And I'd have to figure out how to keep my emotions in check, even when the anger and sadness tried to resurface. The first time I held my baby in my arms, everything else faded away. All the anger, all the betrayal, all the questions I'd spent months agonizing over, it didn't matter in that moment. He was perfect, tiny and fragile, with a little patch of dark hair and a surprisingly strong grip on my finger. Emily looked over at me from the hospital bed, tears in her eyes. She didn't say anything, and neither did I. For the first time in what felt like forever, there was no tension between us. Just this little life we'd created. "Have you thought about a name yet?" she asked softly. "Yeah," I said, smiling down at him. "Ethan, what do you think?" Her lips curved into a small smile. "Ethan's perfect." Learning to co-parent. The first few months of Ethan's life were a blur of sleepless nights and messy schedules. Emily stayed at her sister's house, and I visited as much as I could. We tried to keep things civil, and for the most part, we succeeded. But there were still moments when the cracks showed, moments when the pain of what had happened between us bubbled to the surface. One day, during a drop-off, Emily asked me if I ever thought about what might have happened if she hadn't messed up. "Do you think we'd still be happy?" she asked, her voice tentative. I thought about it for a moment, then shook my head. "I don't know, Emily. Maybe. But there's no point thinking about it now. All we can do is move forward." She nodded, her eyes downcast. "I just wish I'd realized what I had before it was too late." I didn't respond. There wasn't anything else to say. Focusing on myself. Once Ethan started sleeping through the night, I finally had the mental space to focus on rebuilding my life. I kept going to therapy, and over time, the anger and sadness started to loosen their grip on me. My therapist helped me see that what happened wasn't entirely my fault, or Emily's, for that matter. Sure, she made terrible choices, but the cracks in our marriage didn't appear overnight. We both had a hand in letting things fall apart. But understanding that didn't mean I was ready to forgive her. Forgiveness felt like a mountain I wasn't ready to climb yet. Maybe one day I'd get there, but for now I was focused on myself and Ethan. I started going to the gym again, picked up some old hobbies I'd abandoned, and even started dating casually. Felt strange at first, awkward even, but it was also exciting. For the first time in years, I felt like I was rediscovering who I was outside of my marriage. A new normal. Emily and I eventually settled into a rhythm. We split custody of Ethan, alternating weeks and coordinating holidays. It wasn't always easy. There were still arguments and moments of frustration, but we made it work. To her credit, Emily kept her word. She stayed in therapy, avoided Luis entirely, and focused on being the best mom she could be. I could tell she was trying, and I respected her for that, even if I couldn't give her more than my respect. One day, during a drop-off, she handed me a small envelope. "What's this?" I asked, glancing at it. "Just a letter," she said, her voice soft. "Something I've been working on for a while. You don't have to read it, but I wanted you to have it." I waited until I got home to open it. Inside was a handwritten apology, several pages long. She'd poured her heart out, owning up to everything she'd done and the ways she'd hurt me. The last line stuck with me. "I hope one day you can remember the good parts of us, even if the bad parts hurt too much to forget." I folded the letter and tucked it away in a drawer. I wasn't ready to respond, but I appreciated the effort. Looking ahead. Now, a year later, life feels different. Not perfect, but better. Ethan just turned 1 and he's already walking, or at least stumbling around like a drunken little tornado. He's the brightest spot in my life, and every time I see him smile, I'm reminded that not everything about this story is sad. Emily and I are on decent terms. We'll never be best friends, but we've learned how to be good co-parents. And maybe that's enough. As for me, I'm still figuring out what comes next. I'm dating someone now, a woman named Rachel who's kind and funny, and has this way of making me feel like I'm worth something again. It's early, but I'm optimistic. If there's one thing I've learned from all of this, it's that life doesn't follow a script. Sometimes, things fall apart in ways you never expected. But sometimes, those broken pieces can be reshaped into something new, something stronger. I'm not the same person I was before all of this happened. I'm a little more cautious, a little less naive, but I'm also stronger. And for the first time in a long time, I feel like I'm finally moving forward.